All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy's new webinar series, Scrubbing the Skies, the Role of Carbon Dioxide Removal in Combating Climate Change. I'm the series host, Wil Burns, and I'm co-founder of the Institute. The 27th Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention, as all of you know, recently wrapped up in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And I think that many of us believe that it may ultimately be looked back at as an inflection point in terms of the role of carbon dioxide removal in meeting the objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement. This webinar will focus on some of the key developments at the meeting in the context of carbon dioxide removal. And to help us to do so, I'm joined by three excellent panelists, all who have attended COP27 and participated actively in CDR-related activities. Tracy Hester is an instructional associate professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center. Ben Rubin serves as the executive director of the Carbon Business Council, a trade organization for CDR companies. And Chris Neidl is the co-founder of the Open Air Collective, which is a volunteer-led global network that's dedicated to accelerating carbon dioxide removal initiatives. Welcome to all of you. We'll start off with a roundtable discussion of key developments at COP27, and thereafter I'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A. So I'd encourage everyone in the audience to please start populating the Q&A box so that we'll have plenty of grist when we get to that point. So, all right, let's get started. So one of the things that I found really interesting at this meeting was the activities of an initiative called Mission Innovation. And for those of you in the audience that aren't aware of Mission Innovation's activities, it's a group of countries who participate in the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement as parties who have developed this initiative to help accelerate both national development of what they denominate clean energy approaches to address climate change, as well as to try to foster collaboration between the members. And I believe I think there's 23 states that are states parties that are members to Mission Innovation. And at the 27th Conference of the Parties, they announced a new initiative called the Carbon Dioxide Removal Launchpad. And I was wondering if we could kick it off with Chris describing a bit about what that Launchpad is and what some of the activities are that are contemplated.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here with Tracy, Ben, and yourself, Will. Yeah, one thing to say about that announcement, first off, for those of us who are there, it definitely was something that reverberated. You know, there was many different events that related to carbon dioxide removal, but this was certainly a very, very big announcement. And it certainly felt that way from within Sharm el-Sheikh. And what the Launchpad aims to do is it's a coalition of government members, the initial first wave, Canada, European Commission, Japan, Norway, and the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the idea really, there's sort of three different goals to it. It's to really try to, jumpstart cost reduction for CDR technologies through joint investment with a goal of $100 per ton cost. And the idea is if you can bring together different governments to sort of jointly make similar commitments, and the specific one here is to each of the first wave member states will commit to build at least one 1,000 ton CO2 per year CDR project by 2025, which is just right around the corner, and then collectively contributing at least $100 million by 2025 to support CDR pilot projects and demonstrations globally. So it has some feeling almost of a kind of a global CDR hub type of approach. And I think it's really useful given the diversity of members to see what those projects might look like in those different places, utilizing the sort of regulatory and resource assets that those places have, and that we'll learn a lot from that. And again, what I think is really great, might not be huge numbers, but 2025 is just a blink away. So it's really, really kicking off with a very specific near-term goal.
Yeah. Anything to add on that, Ben or Tracy? Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting development in the sense that for a long time at these COPs, there seems to have been a lot of hesitation on the part of governments to talk about the role of CDR for various reasons, and in some ways this seems like an inflection point in that context, right, where there's an acknowledgement of the importance of this, some at least initial investment, and some specific metrics of what success will look like. Tracy, I think you had something to add.
Oh, I wasn't sure if I was stepping on Ben's microphone, but just I was going to say my reaction when it was announced was one, and I suspect share with many who follow CDR. The amounts did seem surprisingly small, but then if you think about it, it's an important icebreaker in terms of the identity of the parties who have signed up to the Launchpad. They're big players. They're really just at this point defining the rules using small stakes. But once they're in place and fully operational, it's a great framework to really ramp it up. So it gets more important. It's more important than the press gave it attention for.
Ben?
Great point. Yeah, great points from Tracy and Chris, and agree with you, Will, that you're picking up on something that I do think was a really important takeaway of COP to see this announced. I think just to underscore some of the points that have been made, I think seeing the cooperation and collaboration between governments on scaling up carbon removal, it's just want to call that out because I think it's exciting to see that development. And then want to also mention for folks who might not be aware, an additional Launchpad announcement that came out on November 17th, the carbon dioxide removal mission within Mission Innovation has also been moving a lot of important cross-border collaboration forward on carbon removal. An innovation roadmap and action plan was released in September around Climate Week. So just wanted to call out for anyone interested in learning more both about the Launchpad announcement, but any of the other work that governments have been moving forward collectively on carbon removal. There's some good resources and reports on the Mission Innovation website.
In two other things I'll just add real quick to that, Will, that were explicit goals of the program. I mentioned it was threefold. The goal is really to get us to 1 gigaton per year of CDR within the next 1 to 2 decades, which again might sound like a long time out, but if we can get on that trajectory, where we ultimately need to get to 10 gigatons per year by 2050, the idea is to really have a specific goal for gigaton deployment. And the other thing that's really built into it as well is part of the analysis is just not how well do these work at removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, what are the project economics, but what are the forms of CDR that are going to enjoy the greatest social acceptance, are going to have other knock-on effects in terms of positive co-benefits. So that's an explicit part of the scope of the project here as well, is to select for those types of solutions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. Yeah, I think in some ways, not establishing ridiculously ambitious goals in some ways made it more credible, and probably something that as a consequence can actually be accomplished. So I thought that was good. There's a number of questions that have come in specifically in terms of the of mission innovation. So I think I'll just try to weave those in while they're fresh in everybody's mind. The first question is Switzerland part of the coalition? Chris?
I'm actually not sure if they are. I can look it up, but as an aside, there's interesting policies that are coming out of Switzerland, which may be on the tail end of the conversation, where I would say Switzerland's an interesting country to look at. They have some really interesting legislative proposals right now for direct air capture specifically that enjoy both support from conservatives as well as from liberals as well. But I'm not sure, actually. Ben might know that if they're included. I can look it up while we go.
Yeah, I'll just drop the press release into the chat with a little bit more info. I don't know about Switzerland in particular off the top of my head, but so folks have the URL, I'll put that in.
Okay. Next question is, will this coalition also support companies like Climeworks, which has developed a roadmap on how to scale up CDR to a gigaton by 2050?
My own sense of it is they're not going to be categorically, yes, certainly DAC and I've lost count. Ben might even have a specific number. The number of DAC companies with different technologies, different form functions at different stages are now in the several dozen. So certainly DAC will be a part of this. The process that goes in place, I think, will follow again from analysis that clicks all of those boxes. What does it mean to do this in Norway versus in Japan or in other locations, and both from a social and from a techno-economic and resource base. So once that criteria is really put in place for selection, you're going to see a variety of different types of forms of CDR. A company like Climeworks is obviously very well positioned because it's so far along, both in terms of its technology, but is also as well as its methodology developments around its own MRV. So I think it'll be pretty agnostic and wide open, but those technologies that are in the furthest along are probably in the best position to really seize the opportunity here.
Just wanted to underscore that one point that Chris made, that we were excited to see that the Launchpad is focusing on a portfolio of CDR approaches, like Chris said. So the announcement does mention direct air capture specifically, but also includes other forms of removal. So the fact that we're seeing governments working together on scaling up multiple forms of removal, we think is promising and working towards that gigaton target.
Yeah. Were there any specific criteria for addressing issues such as permanence in terms of what they were privileging? I know DAX was in there, and BEX, for example. Are they wholly foreclosing nature-based solutions, for example?
My sense is it'll definitely be skewed towards the more technology-based solutions, and an explicit. One of the themes that really came up at COP a lot around CDR was that we have to bring the cost down of high magnitude, high scale potential technologies down, and we have to increase the cost of certain nature-based solutions because they don't sell for high enough. So this is clearly really an innovation policy that's going to be focused on bringing those technological solutions down the cost curve. So I think it'll really be skewed towards more the sort of DAC end of the spectrum. Rather than more conventional nature-based. But again, Tracy and Ben might have more intel on that.
I think you covered it, Chris.
Yep, nothing to add from here.
All right, great. Okay, so some of the other questions that are coming in are not specific to mission innovation. So unless there's anything else in that context, I'll move on to our next question. Some of the most important negotiations in my mind at this meeting revolved around operationalizing Article 6, right? The so-called market-based mechanisms that are supposed to reflect to some degree the philosophy in the Kyoto Protocol in terms of the use of market-based mechanisms, but in the incarnation in the Paris Agreement, much vaguer, right, than in Kyoto, where you had dedicated articles to specific sort of mechanisms. Here, it was contemplated that the parties would ultimately flesh out the contours of the market-based mechanisms, and some recognition that the market-based mechanisms weren't terribly effective in Kyoto. So I think some aspiration that this work would help to make them more robust in the context of Article 6. And so one question I had is, obviously, some of this work in the context of especially Article 6.2 and Article 6.4, maybe 6.6 also, is pertinent to carbon dioxide removal. Were there specific developments or references to CDR in the context of Article 6 at this meeting? I guess I'd start with you, Tracy, as the true law person.
Oh, well, but that sort of lead in, it's always trouble. Yes, very much so. And part of the reason why it's a subject of interest in Article 6 is that Article 6 is one of the few places where removal is explicitly designated as separate from mitigation. And usually removal tends to get swamped or folded into mitigation discussions. And a lot of focus specifically on how to actually track and credit and trade removal as opposed to other types of reduction outcomes. And I think, while the banner headlines have all focused on loss and damage and the sort of lack of progress on mitigation, truth is there were some big steps taken towards actually getting the process, the marketplace laid out under 6.4, but we ain't there yet. And right now, we basically had some proposed draft decisions issued by the supervisory body that provoked a lot of discussion. But at the end of the day, when the negotiations were going late into the night, they ultimately could not reach consensus that would actually set out the principles, but they did reach an agreement on a framework to try and hash it out before COP28. So as a result, probably the biggest takeaway is that there's now a framework in place for broader, more consensus-driven input from more parties so that we can actually have a credible pathway ahead to reaching a decision when we get to the United Arab Emirates next year. There is a deadline, March 15th next year, for everyone to get their comments in. So think about it as the Ides of March for climate. With that in mind, there's also a June 2023 deadline as well on sort of working through some of the issues of overhang from Kyoto, which was one of the big problems. There's a lot of what was called junk credits floating around, where they want to try to make sure that they don't get credit or that the transition period where they get some benefit get truncated as short as possible. So the bottom line here is that this expanded process is going to be, quote, structured so that there will be more opportunity to preserve a space for indigenous communities and other historically underprivileged groups to have a stronger voice. There's going to be an explicit emphasis on including human rights issues and other types of non-market drivers in terms of factors for designing the system. And the idea is to just clear as much of the brush as possible before next year. Quite frankly, the perception is that we just got a late start this year. And as a result, there was just too much to get done in too short a time. And this is now explicitly designed to try and avoid that from happening again. Also, I'll just say as a small note as well, I was attending the conference actually on behalf of the American Bar Association. So I was focusing predominantly on issues related to lawyers and climate change and ethical issues. There are some interesting cross connections there in terms of client obligations dealing with carbon removal representations and what a lawyer needs to be doing in terms of client conscious practice. So for those listening online who want to have that separate conversation, I just wanted to sort of let you know that that is very active area of discussion. We actually had a multinational bar association meeting on those issues, and I suspect that these two areas are going to increasingly intersect as time goes by.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the real major bones of contention that need to still be resolved in terms of 6.4, Tracy?
Well, the ones that came up repeatedly were first consistency between 6.2 and 6.4. To the extent that there's actually going to be internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, that there's credit provided for them, we need to make sure that the methodology to provide the amount is consistent between the two portions of the article. A lot of concern about the question we've always had: transparency, permanence, leakage. The lessons of Kyoto are still hanging over one's heads, and we still have not brought those all fully to bear. Human rights and respect for sustainability impacts of some of these tradings were also explicitly on the table, and making sure that those were transparently and credibly addressed as well. So again, no big surprises, no one big sticking point. It's just that whole constellation of issues that have made it a challenge to have a market trading system that actually protects the climate, but actually achieves a good result in a time frame that's actually useful.
Anything to add, Ben or Chris, to that?
That was wouldn't jump ahead of Tracy. I think his expertise on that is far ahead of mine, but it certainly was raised a lot, the Article 6 issues. If I could, Will, as well, I'm not able to add links to the chat here, but folks who want to get some insight into what actually happened during COP27, Ben and I were involved in carbon removals at COP. It's carbonremovals.org or .earth with a number of other organizations. And there's a lot of recorded sessions there, as well as some daily briefs. and this issue of Article 6, as well as many other things we're going to touch upon. There's sort of a feast of video there that you can really sort through and take a look at some of the sessions. They're all posted.
Thanks, Tracy and Chris. Yeah, I think Tracy did an excellent job of covering Article 6, both how the conversations played out at COP and then what to look ahead for as we're thinking about COP28. I think one additional call out that I want to make is that I thought it was significant to see the UNFCCC issue a request for public input ahead of COP27 about how carbon removal would play out. All of those public comments that were submitted are all available online. It looks like there's been over 40 responses, and I think it's really interesting to just see the different kind of organizations watching this, the perspectives that folks have, and I think it starts to give us a preview of what's ahead, all of the different timelines and tension points that Tracy was talking about, just highlighting who's following the conversation, what folks are saying. Those are all available on the UNFCCC website. So just the significance of a specific request for comment coming out about carbon removal ahead of COP, and then the comments themselves, folks might find of interest.
And well, I'll do the dangerous task of commenting on my own comment, but I will say the one question I did get asked that was parallel to, but not directly responsive to what you asked. The question I got surprisingly often was, how would the Inflation Reduction Act factor into any kind of Article 6.4 trading mechanism? I mean, there's an enormous amount of cash sloshing around the United States right now, and how that's going to factor in with additionality and verification obligations, to a certain extent without disadvantaging United States enterprises is on a lot of people's minds right now.
Yeah. Was there any discussion there about Article 6.8 in the context of CDR?
From my perspective, I didn't hear it and I haven't seen it, but I'll also defer to Chris or Ben if they've seen
that. I have not, but again, we'll can Google right now.
Yeah, I think 6.8's gonna have interesting legs for CDR in the future at some point, given the references to technology transfer and things of that nature. It seems like it'd be terribly pertinent and maybe feed back into 6.2 and 6.4 in terms of these agreements. But I was just curious if you'd heard anything. Okay, unless anybody has anything else in that context, I'll move on to our next question. So there was another reason I think that this was really an inflection point is there was a plethora of side events related to CDR at this meeting, and is just interested. Which of these meetings do you think were particularly significant at the conference?
I'm happy to jump in there to start, and then I think Chris and Tracy will likely have additions. Just wanted to underscore that website that Chris mentioned, carbonremovals.org, which aggregated and was a calendar for all of these different events. I think it was exciting to see the diversity of events and the number of events, and I think, like Chris said, a lot of the sessions are recorded. I think I want to call out there that really with the multitude of events that happened, they were hosted by a lot of different elements of the carbon removal ecosystem. So you saw events convened and led by civil society and NGOs. You saw events of corporates or foundations thinking about removals, for startups thinking about removal. So it really spans the gamut. I think a lot of the events also highlighted the intersection that removal can play with resiliency and reducing emissions and how things are in tandem with it. So we saw some of that playing out with events about ocean health. Where does ocean-based carbon removal fit in with the global health of the oceans? And so it was exciting to see those intersections on the global stage. And then I think some additional call-outs from my end that I want to mention is just the multitude of events that were elevating voices from the global south, whether they were grassroots leaders or elected leaders in governments, thinking about the role that carbon removal can play from a global climate justice perspective, was also exciting to see. One that I want to call out in particular is an event that was hosted by Futures Lab, and that's available on the homepage of the carbonremovals.org website. Some really powerful voices and perspectives about the state of the global carbon removal ecosystem and how to ensure it can scale up responsibly. And then also wanted to call out the leadership of the Global Carbon Removal Partnership that convened a roundtable discussion that included a lot of government leaders from the global south who are thinking about the role that carbon removal can play both in their countries for development and climate goals over the next several months, along with the role that carbon removal can play in COP28. So a couple of call outs from my end, and excited to see what additions Chris and Tracy might have on that.
Yeah, and I would also just flash back a year earlier. I was at Glasgow, and I think a few of you were as well. And it was not something that was really being talked about. It's sort of the love whose name we dare not speak for a long time, that many people know we need to do it, but it wasn't reflected in the robustly, certainly not in the formal programming in the blue zone or green zone, and not even really so much in side events, except for one notable event from Carbon Gap. This year, very different. And again, if you just look at the carbonremovals.org website, you'll see the diversity along the lines of what Ben just talked about, is that there were a lot of think tanks, and there were, industry sponsored events, but there was so many that were really from civil society. And I do think that one of the most remarkable patterns that we saw was how much of the content was about pioneers and project development and value addition that could happen in the global South in frontline communities. That was a really, really prominent theme, reflected in several really excellent panels. And the one that Ben just mentioned, the Futures Lab was really quite good. It gives you a very good dose of that. And then there was a lot, as you would expect, a lot about certification, MRV. That was, just sort of a hugely important theme throughout much of the sessions, is that, how across this diverse portfolio of CDR forms in diverse contexts, are we going to have a comparable frameworks that can really make sure that we know that this is happening and we can take it to the bank. So a number of good panels as well that pertain to that.
I don't have a lot to add substantively. That Ben and Chris did an excellent job, but I'll offer a small confessional note. For those of you online who have been there, the thing about being at a COP is it's just overwhelming. There's a cacophony of noise. There's dozens of events all happening at the same time, people milling about. And as a result, it's really hard to keep a focus on the thread of conversation. So one thing I would suggest is that the virtual pavilion on carbon removal was extraordinarily helpful. I mean, there were over 70 side events. And to the extent you want to see one-stop shopping in a way that is graspable, I highly recommend it. Second, a lot of protests, a lot of activity. I saw protests from everything from veganism to loss and damages, several different protests there, but nothing about the concept of the carbon dioxide removal at scale, and, including ambient atmospheric removal, which would have been a bit controversial in prior COPs. Here it is just baked in at this point, it seems. It doesn't really seem to be getting a lot of attention in itself. There is focus on its side effects, which people are concerned about, particularly in terms of indigenous lifestyles. But that doesn't, for my mind, that's sort of an interesting watermark that we've kind of gotten past at this point. And I think it kind of helps set the terms for engagement for COP28 now.
Yeah, and to that point too, Tracy, I think it really resonated with the master theme of this conference, with loss and damage, and we see restoration as an implied part of that, is a way of treating loss and damage. Can we restore? And that obviously centrally involves carbon dioxide removal. And there's some really good speakers. One activist at the Futures Lab from Fridays for Future named Maria Reyes, who's a climate activist based in Mexico. And if you go look at that session, it was just very interesting for her how she was talking about carbon removal within the larger questions around climate justice, climate reparations, and loss and damage. And they really rhymed in a really, I think, interesting way. So I think it really resonated well with the master theme of the conference.
Yeah, I want to call out Chris's mention of MRV, because I think that the COP may have a really important role to play in this context in the future. A lot of the standards in the voluntary carbon markets are very different from a context of MRV, and it's still kind of the Wild West. But I think if ultimately CDR becomes a substantive part of Article 6, and the Paris Rulebook starts fleshing out accounting requirements, that may ultimately establish a lot of standards for MRV that ultimately become enshrined, maybe not only in the regulatory markets, but maybe taken up by the voluntary markets. I think it's very interesting, because there's some of the most, in my opinion, some of the most substantive discussions starting about MRV in the CDR context in Paris, which makes sense given the granularity of how those kind of accounting practices are usually developed in that framework. So I think that's going to be interesting to watch. Okay. Anything else in terms of side events? Okay. All right. Next question. This one's for Chris. There were also some announcements by U.S. States of initiatives related to CDR, and I know Open Air Collective obviously has a robust role in working with states in terms of CDR initiatives. So I figured that was something you were tracking. I wonder if you could summarize what some of those announcements were at the meeting.
Yeah, there was state, and then there were other ones too in terms of nation actors in different shapes or form. I mean, I think certainly the Launchpad announcement from the Fed, and then also this being the occasion after the recent passage of the IRA to kind of explicate that, you know, in a COP environment. So there was a lot of policy announcements and elaborations tied to that. In the US, there was two announcements. There was the Massachusetts Senate Minority Leader, Cynthia Stone Cream, announced her intention to introduce in January at the beginning of the state session the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act of Massachusetts, which is has much in common with the bill that was introduced in New York. It's essentially a CDR procurement, state-led CDR procurement policy, which we're really happy to see, very much grounded in environmental justice, just transition. Really excited about that. So that will be introduced in the beginning of this next session. We also had Senator Josh Becker, who is the co-chair of the Joint Climate Policy Committee in California. He's a senator from the Bay Area. They announced their intention to introduce what they're calling the California Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act, which is also an incentive, and there'll be more details on that, but those were both made in short 5-minute announcements during COP. And then we also had, just on the other side of the pond, one policy that we're really excited about is the Luxembourg negative emissions tariff, which was also one that Open Air was very involved in. That was introduced during COP by a member of parliament. And that is modeled somewhat, it's a demand stimulus policy that draws certain elements from the renewable energy feed-in tariff as a sort of an incentive mechanism for certain forms of CDR. And I think Ben was also there too. There was just a lot of talk about creating a more conducive, enabling environment for CDR in different places, particularly in the global South. A lot of very high-level representatives from the Kenyan government, including the Office of the Presidency, were really talking in very clear terms about their interest in really making a CDR sector really work in places like Kenya where it really could work. But heard similar things from Indonesia, Colombia, Chile. So there was a lot of talk from policymakers about an increased orientation about CDR as part of their overall, sort of package of, of efforts vis-a-vis climate and economic development.
Anything to add, Ben or Tracy?
You have something? I would like to defer to Ben first before I jump in, because of course I'm going to talk about Texas for a little bit.
Ben?
Yeah, no, Tracy, you should go ahead. I think just Tracy already mentioned it, and I've seen a couple of questions in the chat, just the name of that website. So it's carbonremovals.org. There's an extra S there. I think that the use of removals may have been tripping some folks up and going to it. But I think sifting through that, looking at the closing press release that was put out in the blog section, that just recaps a lot of the different announcements that were made. And I think Chris just did an excellent job of highlighting it wasn't only the events that were happening on the stage over in Egypt, but the raft of additional announcements that came out around COP to just make sure that folks are staying up to speed with everything that happened. So Chris gave you all of that, and just wanted to mention that website URL one more time so folks can look at that closing press release, which has a recap of the various different subnational, local, national announcements that were coming out around COP27.
Yeah, and there's an S at the end of that. If you can't hear it, it's the more UK standard of carbon removals, plural, .org, not carbonremoval.org, just to be clear.
Yeah, and I apologize. For some reason, somebody told us we don't have our chat box up. I'll try to get that fixed for the next meeting, but I'm afraid if I try to do anything right now, I'll disconnect us. So my apologies. I'll see if I can get that fixed. Tracy, Texas.
I'd say I've reduced many a Zoom webinar to a smoking ruin by trying to do stuff like that.
Yes, exactly.
So First of all, Chris, I got to thank you for giving me something brand new, which is I've never thought about a negative emissions tariff, which is going to be a lot of fun to sort of dig into. So I'm very curious about it. I just wanted to say, Chris has done an excellent job at describing the explicit state level initiatives dealing with carbon dioxide removal. But I also would suggest that folks might want to watch out for subtext, where particularly states that are on the other side of the political aisle, but also have large commercial stakes in carbon dioxide removal, are implementing some below the radar policies that help make it possible without directly financially paying for or subsidizing it. So in Texas, for example, we've got some very large scale projects currently under construction for direct air capture and CDR. In particular, most recent legislative accomplishment is banning any kind of state investment by ESG favoring banks in state and retirement portfolios. And it makes, as a result, you see ways to support it in areas you wouldn't expect. For example, one of the projects I was just talking about, where they're going to be building a large infrastructure to inject CO2 underground. One of the things that you can do in Texas is you can essentially mitigate your property taxes if you are installing pollution control equipment. So it's designed to prevent, for example, big property tax bump ups if you put a scrubber onto a power plant. Well, there's already a proposal to the Railroad Commission to basically make the entire DAC operation tax exempt for any property increase value. So that would be an enormous Texas subsidy that is going to be completely off the radar. No one's going to be aware of it. The second is liability protection. And Texas, like many states right now, is a bit of a muddle as to who owns pore space where you're putting the CO2. There's a proposal that is brewing, that'll be the next legislative session, where it's going to be clear that the state will assume liability for long-term releases from stored CO2 in state pore space, particularly offshore. I just want to point out that's another very large implicit subsidy, but it's also one that's fragmenting the energy sector. There are some companies that do not want the state to take that action, and it's already provoking an attempt to stop the state from receiving delegation of its injection well program from EPA because of concerns that's going to promote some reckless practices. So all a long way of saying it's not just dollars per ton. There's very creative accounting going on right now to basically shift some very large subsidies to private actors that people just aren't aware of.
Great, thanks for that, Tracy. Okay, we have a lot of questions in the box, so I'm going to try to get to those now for the remainder of our time. First question here is, my understanding is that the oil companies were well represented at this COP. What was their presence in the CDR conversation? Was that presence well received? Anybody want to take that?
Actually, in all of the sessions that we tracked for carbonremovals.org, which allowed people who were putting on events to tell us about it, we would list them, and then us proactively putting on our own and going out. Ben, unless I missed something, I can't think of a single one where there was actual formal representation by oil and gas companies, at least in the ones that we looked at. It wasn't really part of it. There was some in Norway, around storage, that might have been it, but it wasn't. There was a lot of oil and gas. There was a lot of press about how overrepresented oil and gas was, but they weren't really showing up, and they certainly weren't driving CDR events, the ones that were on our calendar, which were pretty exhaustive.
Ben, before I jump in, do you want to say something on that?
Go ahead.
Same impression. Again, I was unfortunately a little bit distracted because I was looking at the lawyer side events, but which there were vanishingly few, I will freely admit. But there was not an oil majors platform out there that I saw. Now, that's not to say there weren't a lot of fossil fuel presence, particularly if you went to the United Arab Emirates Pavilion. Man, a lot of fossil fuel discussion there. But Yeah, I didn't see an overt, explicit presence by BP/Shell/Exxon participating or weighing in on a CDR debate.
There is one, Will, I will say, and I won't name it specifically, but there was one that we were invited to around sort of off the beaten path, and it was actually funded by a natural gas actor. This was not part of Carbon Dioxide Removal Act COP. And when it was proposed, should we include CDR in there? So it was hydrogen, it was CCS. There was no was the answer. They didn't want to be talking about CDR at that event. That was during the first week. So I had a little bit of an insight that's anecdotal, but that was interesting. I thought that an actual event that came from oil and gas did not want to muddy the water and talk about CDR. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because they're clearly involved, right? There's reference to Oxy in this Corpus Christi development, right? And plenty of other projects, but it'll be interesting to see if that changes in the future also, or if they just think it's too much of a political hot potato, I guess, to be involved. Anything else, Ben?
No, I think it's been covered. I guess I just want to reiterate what was in that carbonremovals.org is the diversity and multitude of organizations in the space that I think really show like the larger civil society effort or startup effort or government effort coalescing around how to think about the deployment, governance, and scaling up of carbon removal. It was exciting to see the multitude of different actors coming together to really put this on the stage at COP.
And how much that contrasts, Ben, with I think what some perceptions are that DAC is just it's a kind of a Trojan horse for fossil fuels. And I think that it's not just the extent of the programming that we had on that, which again was somewhat crowdsourced, but it was all the different types of groups that are pushing for CDR in different forms. And again, not really any kind of presence to be found among oil and gas actors, at least formally. So.
Okay. Next question. There's an understandable focus on CDR, but is there any discussions around other greenhouse gas removals, such as methane?
Try to remember, Ben, or Tracy, if there was actually a session on removal. There's certainly a great hardcore group of people that are very active in methane removal that were actually present at the conference that I did bump into. And so I don't recall in the programming, though, much discussion, if any, in methane removal or other greenhouse gas removal. But that's a matter of maturation. By next year, hopefully we will see that. Look how far we've come in just a year. And that conversation is really picking up. And you probably talked about it on your podcast here, Will. So I would expect it to become more featured in future COPs.
Yeah, for what it's worth, that's my sense as well. I did have some glancing conversations with folks about methane mitigation, but actual atmospheric ambient methane removal, I didn't see a specific side event or focused discussion about those yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
Yeah, I would just call out is one thing to look for, because I don't think it's explicitly come up in the discussion yet, is in the draft text, there was a brief reference to developed countries being net negative by the year 2030. It didn't make it into the final text, but I just wanted to explicitly call that out, the significance of that making it in. And then I think there's an open question for anyone interested in going into the different nationally determined contributions of countries about how they're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, to look at how removals are factoring in with reducing emissions, to look at if anyone's talking about methane mitigation or removal. So just wanted to bring up that specific net negative reference, although it didn't make it in, and then that the NDCs themselves, these nationally determined contributions, I think we'll have a wealth of insights for anyone who ends up wanting to sift or dig through them.
Let's see. Next question. Let's see. Question is biochar as a means of CDR being taken seriously? Was there extensive discussion at this meeting about biochar?
Quite a bit, actually. It did pop up, and in all its amazing diversity, there was some really interesting projects that were featured through some of our events. The Future Labs event really interesting biochar for smallholding farmers in the last mile, coming up with a model that would allow them to produce biochar and then also be able to directly tap into carbon markets, which is a key thing, a real barrier that we have. You know, some of the people who can most benefit from biochar are really difficult for them to participate in the complex and expensive biochar certification. So it did come up a lot, as it always does at any CDR related thing. There was also a CDR reception, which had a great, real mix of people from different backgrounds. There's a lot of talk about biochar there. It was an informal event, but certainly a lot of practitioners were present at that.
Next question. Was there extensive discussion at COP27 about the moral hazard question, i.e. whether CDR is going to crowd out other forms of mitigation in a way that's detrimental?
Go ahead, Ben.
I can jump in and do a first crack at that. I think that at COP27, we really saw the elevation of how removal is stood up as an additional pillar of climate action in tandem with reducing emissions and in tandem also with the critical work of preparing for the impacts of climate change with adaptation. So I think we saw in a lot of the events discussion about how removals and mitigation can work in tandem with one another. If we do see a net negative or a net zero pledge, the role that reducing emissions is playing in that as well as roles in removal. So I think we saw that important both and context, that the role that removals can play, again, in tandem with mitigation. But curious if Tracy or Chris have any additional thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it was a measure of progress that, as you know, it's so often, even if you're talking to people that are very much immersed in climate policymaking, it's hard to get off of that first base. You take up an enormous amount of time and energy, and there's valid concerns there. But I think the fact that it didn't come up repeatedly, it wasn't something that sort of stalled every conversation, or at least that's what every conversation was focused on, is a measure of progress that I think people understand there's a lot of nuance there now, and that there's ways of overcoming moral hazard through good policy. And so it was not, much to my surprise, as a 5-year CDR veteran now, it was not a dominant theme that really came up in conversations about the CDR at COP.
Yeah, I'll just add a me too. It has become the expected and implicit predicate for any discussion about CDR that you begin by stating it's not a substitute. And as a result, people now it's baked in, they expect it. It is just not as much of a controversial issue for most of the discussions, at least as I saw over at COP27. I will say it did sort of float in the background for some of the Article 6.4 discussions in terms of how you provide credit for reductions associated with just offsetting ongoing emissions as opposed to actual atmospheric reductions. But not a whole lot of discussion about how to translate that into a discount rate or other types of credit that would be different. But it's clearly on people's minds. That's sort of let's call it a numerical ghost of moral hazard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder how that'll play in. I mean, obviously the European Union, as it's developing its standards, right, has kind of explicitly created a 2-track standard acknowledging moral hazard. I wonder if ultimately we'll see that in 6.4.
Well, I expect it'll be influential, and if I remember correctly, the EU approach that's currently being on the table is a cap. So you know, it may not be a numerical discount rate as much as just this much and no more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that from Chris or Ben? Okay. Let's see. Was there any discussion around governments as buyers of highly verifiable engineered solutions for carbon removals? Does this feature into the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely did. And just because it's been kind of a big year for various different state actors to be wading into that, you know, certainly we had the Bayes UK GGR proposal, which is, you know, really about that. So a lot of those things did come up. I think there was generally a sense that the voluntary market and the standards around certification and MRV are maturing enough where we're getting to a point where state actors coming in and directly being procurers of CDR through various different models is really kind of a next step. So it was definitely featured as a subject in a lot of the conversations around CDR and sessions. With also a real nod to what the private sector has done. I mean, that's a really thing that's really impressive too in such a short period of time. Raising awareness, there would be none of this California bill or the Massachusetts bill or the LNET if not for what Frontier and other actors have done, which gives them a reference point to say, yeah, like this, but public with some modifications. So that's the enduring impact, I think, of those private sector purchasing programs, is they've started to really make it legible for governments. And so I think this year, hopefully, we'll start to see some of those turn into law.
Chris covered it. I think I would just also specifically call out that in the raft of announcements we're referencing during COP27, now there's a lot of different news to unpack and sift through. I wanted to mention that in the second week of COP, the CREST Act was introduced in the House, which is bipartisan legislation that has a government carbon removal purchasing element. It was introduced by Rep. Peters and Rep. Curtis. And again, that's the House version. There's Senate legislation as well. And the press release is on Representative Peters' website if anyone wanted to take a look through and see the details of that as it relates to government procurement of CDR.
Yeah, I'll just add a small grace note, which is I didn't hear a lot of overt discussion of government bulk purchases of CDR credits, but it is interesting to consider the interplay of the Inflation Reduction Act and $180 plus per ton direct pays from the federal government of the United States, integrated with a potential international trading market for reductions taking place outside the United States. California, with its low carbon fuel standard, has kind of pioneered the path of getting some form of government credit for reductions obtained through projects elsewhere associated with fuels production. I don't think anyone's kind of mapped out what any kind of Article 6.4 framework is going to work in conjunction with a direct government subsidy for the United States. I'm pretty sure, though, that you're not going to be able to broker a credit and then getting a bump up for the United States for the same ton of CO2 reduction. But it's interesting to think about how they're going to make all those work together.
Yeah, I think invariably there's trade challenges ahead, right? In some of these contexts, right? Yeah.
Ahead or now.
Or now.
Yeah, we're already starting to see it.
Yeah, it's true. Couple of housekeeping sort of questions. One was, I think, Ben, the reference to the new California initiative. What was the name of that initiative again?
The legislation?
Yeah.
It's called the Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act, is what it will be called. And that's, again, Josh Becker is the sponsor of that in the Senate.
Okay. And for you, Tracy, I think there was a couple of questions related to Texas and its newfound religion on carbon removal. One question was, where can we find more information on the Texas liability shifting provision and the EPA Class 6 primacy?
Well, unfortunately, there's not one-stop shopping for those. Right now, I'll do it in two baskets. For the primacy question, right now, there is legislation that was passed in the prior legislative session that specifically selects, believe it or not, our Railroad Commission as the agency in charge of injection wells, and essentially has authorized resources to make an application to EPA Region 6 to get that program in place. That is underway. But the catch is that, unfortunately, it hasn't yet been submitted, and I can't point our listener to a specific place where they can see the package and the status of EPA's consideration of it. The time frame right now is they're looking to get it finalized next year. And there is a lot of priority and emphasis in trying to get it in place because, apart from CDR, there's a large contingent in Texas that views point source carbon capture and sequestration as basically an existential question of being able to continue in a viable way with fossil fuels into the future. So there's a lot of bipartisan support in Texas for that, for reasons you wouldn't expect. In terms of the other issue, in terms of liability protection, there are two places. One is that there's already legislation in the books in Texas where there's a liability shift, but in a very particular place. If you're doing offshore sequestration in Texas state waters, we have an enormous saline aquifer storage capacity. The state has already deemed that anyone who enters into a lease with the state of Texas and stores CO2 offshore in Texas saline aquifer waters, that you're going to get a liability protection after a period of years when you finish injection. That is not true for on-site, for land-based CCS. So there's a lot of discussion right now about legislation to do something similar after like a 30-year operating period in Texas. Here's the catch. Like I mentioned before, there's not a unified position in the energy sector on it. And the environmental community is so far already reached out to EPA to ask them not to delegate the program to Texas if it has this liability protection built into it. They want to hold the energy sector's feet to the fire for responsible conduct. So as a result, there is law in the books you can look on for one. There's a letter of protest from the Environmental Defense Fund to EPA Region 6, which is available online if you want to sort of see the state of play. But watch January of next year when all the bills get introduced. That's when you'll see the actual the race for the flag at that point.
Okay. And related to that was a question is clarification. Is Texas assuming liability merely post-closure, or will they assume ownership of pore space?
I guarantee you, if there was an attempt by the state to essentially take over pore space, there would be pitchforks and flaming brands all over the state. No, it's strictly liability. The pore space will remain, at this point, the default is with the surface owners. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that after 30 years, that's about the number that gets floated around. Well, after injection ceases, if there is a long-term release, say like 100 years from now, the state would bear the responsibility for responding to it and compensating for losses. But the pore space remains with either the surface owner or, if they change the rules of the game, with the middle state owner.
Okay. All right. I think I've worked through all of the questions. Does anybody have any final observations?
I have one thing to quickly point out, which kind of pieces together many of the themes we talked about and started to sort of emerge at the last COP. It'll be interesting to see next year at COP how much this evolves. But, you know, there's the question about the obligation of wealthy economies to include, you know, to strive for negative emissions by X year, include CDR in their portfolio of action. Then there was a lot of really impressive content, again, around CDR practitioners in the Global South. And then the question is where projects happen, this idea of really what share of this future $1 trillion CDR economy could actually take root in the Global South? Could this actually be not just a matter of the moral obligation to frontline communities, but could this be a real opportunity for really interesting wealth-producing projects to happen in Africa and Latin America and Asia? And so all the pieces are kind of talking about, you have really eloquent people like James Mwangi really making a very, very clear argument. There's a lot of his content on our site. But between now and next year's COP, will we see some real policy proposals that involve sort of bilateral and multilateral, you know, sort of carbon development projects where you have projects that are in the Global South that are being funded in the North? That I'm really interested in seeing how that takes shape.
Anything else, Chris or Tracy? I mean, Chris or Ben?
All right. I'll defer to you if you want to jump in.
Ben?
Tracy, you can go ahead first.
Okay. I think just perhaps a forward-looking note. Watch for the stage to shift in COP28. Maybe I'm looking at things through my narrow lawyer's lens, but a lot of the discussion I've seen in terms of finance and legal obligations associated with CDR have really rooted pretty much in Article 6, in particular Article 6.4. That's going to change. In COP28 going forward, we're going to be deeply enmeshed in the global stocktake process. And we're going to be seeing the new NDCs being served up. And that is a real opportunity to shift a lot of the CDR discussion much more explicitly up front as part of the national commitments as to what they're going to do over the next 5 years, and break out of this sort of legalistic framing that some of CDRs labored under. You know, it's not just a market issue anymore. It's actually just fundamental compliance with your treaty commitments. And it's a real chance to up the game. So stay tuned. UAE could be very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I've seen some discussion that ultimately the language about highest ambition, right, will necessarily might include what you could do with CDR, right? And maybe not in the next 5 years, but ultimately over the course of the next couple of decades, once you've reached maximum amount of emissions reductions, right? Does highest ambition mandate legally that you have to include CDR in your NDCs? Yeah, interesting question.
Yeah, and I would just say in closing, it builds on the point that Tracy was just making, that COP28 might sound far away, but really the discussions that are percolating now around the role of removals in Article 6, the role that removals will play in these nationally determined contributions, and what will be on the agenda at COP28, it's conversations that are percolating now and will only continue throughout the year. So in addition to doing the look back at the takeaways from COP27, definitely a lot to look ahead to that's actively moving right now in the run up to removals for COP28.
Great. Well, that's a good place to end. We are at the bewitching hour. I'd like to once again thank Tracy, Ben, and Chris for their interventions and all of the questions from the audience. Please join us in the future. I believe it's December 21st. We're going to have a webinar that focuses on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's new white paper on carbon dioxide removal and their role. And I hope a lot of you can join us for that also. So thanks once again to everyone, and goodbye now.